Hey, what's going on, everyone? So, in today's video, we are going to talk about how to use cardio to PR your lifts. Now, this is something that a lot of people don't really understand with a very high degree of accuracy, and so I wanted to essentially present a really strong argument for why, if you are a strength athlete, you should be doing some sort of cardiovascular training or aerobic fitness to really significantly improve your strength and overall performance. So, basically, here's some of the things that we're going to be covering today. First, we're going to talk about bottlenecks to strength performance and how you can overcome them. We're also going to go over some misconceptions regarding aerobic conditioning. We'll talk all about adaptations to aerobic conditioning and why this is important for your strength and performance. And then also strategies to enhance your aerobic fitness and conditioning, and then offer some practical considerations for implementation and even give you a case study at the end. So let's dive right in. First, what are the primary bottlenecks of training? Okay, so some of these things are very, very common in the lifting community, especially if you are a larger athlete. So one is poor recovery. So intra-workout and inter-workout recovery is usually not very good. What this means is you're going to suffer. So for instance, if you're supposed to do like 6 sets of squatting on one day, but then halfway through you get fatigued, well, guess what? Your output is going to go down. If your output goes down, the total magnitude of stimulus you're going to be able to generate is also going to go down. So this ends up meaning that you're too out of shape to actually get into better shape. Right? So you're not actually capable of doing the work necessary to really substantially improve your progress. Now, you might be seeing progress. However, if you're not in good shape, you definitely are leaving results on the table. So this is something to consider even in the case that you are making some decent progress. You're probably still leaving a lot on the table if you don't have good aerobic conditioning. Next, we can think about session-to-session recovery. So how long does it take you to recover and feel good? Between sessions? Are you needing to deload every 2 to 3 weeks or every 4 weeks? Or are you able to take your training longer? If we can improve your recovery within a workout and also improve your recovery from session to session, guess what? You're going to be able to extend your time to exhaustion within a single session, but then also you're going to be able to extend that timeline of productive training before actually needing a deload, because you're going to be able to get in a lot of high quality training and your recovery is really going to be on point. So this brings us to point number 2, work capacity. Oftentimes, if you have poor aerobic conditioning, your work capacity just isn't very good. So an inability to sustain high training output, as I was mentioning earlier. If you can't sustain high training output, the total stimulus that you're going to be able to generate is going to be significantly, or can be significantly blunted, which means you're going to get a worse adaptive response. So let's talk briefly about misconceptions. A lot of the times people are talking about interference effect. Oh, if you're a strength athlete, you shouldn't do cardio because it's going to kill your strength gains or muscle gains or whatever. This is really just an argument for convenience. The reality is most strength athletes are actually just fucking lazy. And because they're lazy, this is just a very convenient excuse that they use in order to get out of doing aerobic conditioning. Now, is it accurate? Well, there's an element of truth to it. However, it's often misunderstood. So, is it actually an interference effect? The interference effect was proposed, many, many years ago, and essentially talks about how there's a conflicting signaling that's actually occurring. So there's different metabolic signaling that happens when we are training for strength versus hypertrophy versus power and speed versus endurance, etc., etc. Now, the interference effect essentially suggests that when you do concurrent type training, which means when you train for multiple adaptive responses at the same time, that you're going to get this interference effect, which ultimately downregulates the total adaptive response you see in any of those given areas. Now, part of this is true, but it's not likely due to any sort of interference effect. What's likely happening is that it's actually just a zero-sum game. So your body is competing for resources, both adaptive and recovery-based. So for instance, if your total ability to recover, let's just talk about squat, bench, and deadlift, for instance. If your total ability to recover is, let's say, 20 total sets spread across squat, bench, and deadlift, this is just hypothetical. That's as much as you can recover from. And that's also like while still making productive results. Okay. So if you want to enhance your squat, that means you need to pull resources from your bench and your deadlift. You have to. You will have to reduce the total amount of sets that you're doing for your bench and your deadlift if you want to add those onto your squats. So you are going to be competing for resources. So is the interference effect a real thing? Well, not really. However, we do need to consider how we're allocating our training volume and how it's affecting our ability to recover. Now, this should not be a problem for the vast majority of people, right? Because again, it's kind of a dose-response relationship. So, for instance, it's not like you're just going to go balls to the wall and just start doing tons and tons of conditioning. No, that's not a good idea, right? However, if we're able to improve our aerobic fitness, that'll actually increase the size of your engine. So rather than competing for limited resources, it actually increases the totality of resources that you have to allocate. So interference effect, probably not, really something to be concerned about. However, competing for recovery and adaptive resources, yes, that is a consideration. But again, it's certainly not going to be a rate limiting factor if you do this correctly, because it's actually going to enhance the total amount of energy you can spend on any given exercise. So it's actually going to enhance your ability to train and produce high levels of output consistently. So coming back to point number 2, it's a dose-response relationship. So again, if there's a big difference between running for, let's say, 10 minutes twice a week versus running 2 hours twice a week, right? So the duration's definitely going to be a massive variable there. Then the total volume. Now, duration and volume can be related, and there's definitely overlap there. However, if your running pace is going to be different when you're doing 2 hours versus, you can have 2 different running paces and if you're running for 2 hours, the volume is going to be different. So even though you're running for 2 hours, the total amount of density is going to be different. So volume and duration are going to be slightly different, even though there is some overlap. Then frequency. Again, are you doing 5 days a week cardio? Are you doing 1 day a week cardio? Are you doing conditioning that's actually built into your program? Like all of these things matter. And then the intensity, right? So even if I have a very low volume and very low duration, let's say I'm only actually doing my aerobic conditioning for, let's say, 5 minutes, but I am pushing to a point that's just verging on almost anaerobic, right? So very fast runs, maybe not a sprint, but a very fast run. I might only be doing 5 minutes of total work, but the intensity is very high. So that's obviously going to generate substantially more fatigue than if I were to do 5 minutes of a slow-paced run. So the intensity also matters, and the modality does as well. For instance, if you're swimming or if you're doing the elliptical, maybe the elliptical doesn't really have any impact. It also doesn't really have any eccentric loading elements to it. It's pretty damn easy to do and to recover from. However, if you're running, especially if you're running on a trail hike or an unstable surface, that's going to increase the eccentric demands, which can increase your level of soreness and DOMs and extend the time to recovery, right? So there's going to be differences in terms of fatigue and your response based on the modality that you choose. Again, sprinting versus cycling versus elliptical versus swimming versus just doing sport-specific conditioning. In your training, there's a variety of different things, and all of these things definitely matter, and we'll get to a lot of that stuff at the end of this video. Now, the third misconception is that cardio inhibits strength and hypertrophy. So again, as I mentioned previously, this just is not true. Now, there's a point to increasing your aerobic fitness, right? Because if your aerobic fitness is down here, but we need it to be up here in order to really get the most out of your training, we need to find a way to push it up to that level. However, beyond a certain point, you're absolutely not going to see any additional benefits. So once we get to a certain level of aerobic fitness, pushing beyond that point won't make any additional benefits for our resistance training. However, we actually might run the risk in that case of just doing way too much and actually impairing our ability to recover from our primary training, which is our strength training. So there is definitely a limit to how much you want to be doing, But again, most people just are not in very good shape, and doing some a little bit of cardio every week definitely is not going to impact their performance in that way. That's more just if you take it to the extreme, right? So let's look at adaptations to aerobic conditioning and why it actually improves your strength performance, okay, as well as just power, hypertrophy, and everything else. Okay, these are indirectly related. Some of them are indirectly related, anyways. So the first is that it can decrease your heart rate. So we get greater venous return. We get an increase in your stroke volume, which means you're getting more blood out per pump. Okay, this means we can increase the amount of training volume that we're doing. We get better oxygenation of blood as well, and better nutrient transport. So we also see an increase in capillary density. So increased capillarization improves oxygen and nutrient transport to muscle, which again can improve your actual performance during training and enhance your recovery from session to session. We also see an enhancement in glycogen repletion, so the ability of your body to replenish glycogen stores once they've been used. This is enhanced. We improve your recovery and performance from session to session, but also within a single session. Next, we have metabolites. So metabolites are these metabolic byproducts that are essentially created as a response to the physical work that you're doing during your training. Now, these metabolites can actually impair your performance. So these are things like hydrogen ion, lactate, etc. Lactate actually is a buffer, so it's actually really important for extending your training, but that's a little bit more technical, so we don't need to go into that. But essentially, we have all these metabolic waste products that are called metabolites, and doing aerobic conditioning actually enhances your ability to clear these metabolic byproducts, which actually extends your time to exhaustion. So again, if you're one of those individuals who has like really hard sessions, but by the end of it, you're kind of dragging your feet, you're feeling pretty exhausted, well, guess what? Doing some aerobic conditioning can actually really help improve your performance and make sure that you can maintain high levels of output through the entire duration of your session, so you're not just getting the most of the first third or the first half, and then kind of, like just sort of getting by on the latter half. So what are some strategies to increase your aerobic conditioning? Well, there's a variety of different things that you can do, but some of the easier ones to implement are going to be making sure that you're timing your actual rest intervals. This is a huge mistake that I see powerlifters make all the time. You ask them, oh, how long are you resting? Oh, I don't know, until I'm recovered. Okay, that's fine. Like, that's not necessarily a bad answer. However, I do think that we can do a much better job at that for a couple of reasons. Again, if we're just always resting, then it doesn't really improve our level of fitness. And again, if our fitness level goes down, our ability to tolerate our total workload goes down. If your ability to tolerate workload goes down, guess what? Your results are going to go down long term. So one really important thing that I focus on with all of my athletes is timing their rest intervals on everything, or at least on most things. There are some times where I do think that it's probably best for the athlete to determine that themselves. But for the most part, I will have them time everything because I want to understand how all these variables are influencing their program design and ultimately their outcomes, right? Because if you take if you take 180 seconds rest between squats on one set, and then the next week you take 5 minutes rest and you go up in weight, well, did you get stronger or did you just rest more, right? So the more that we can track these things, the better, because it makes it a little bit clearer, what's actually driving these performance increases. Next, we want to increase work density. And sorry, when I say next, these are just options. I'm not saying you have to do any of these or all of these or in any particular order. We're going to increase work density. So this would be, if normally you take really long rest periods, decreasing rest periods can increase work density. We can, take, let's say you're doing 5 sets of 3. Well, instead we could do, 15 sets of 1 and take 30 seconds rest in between each rep. So instead of doing 5 sets of 3 with 5 minutes rest, we've substantially increased the amount of work that we're doing per unit of time, and we've decreased the total time that it takes to actually complete the entire set, the entire series of exercises. You can do rest pause. So again, instead of doing 2 sets of 10, you can do myo reps, where you could do, your set of 10, take a little break, and then do another set of 10. You could do cluster sets. There's a variety of different things that you can do there. You can increase your step count. This is probably one of my favorite things, and it's one of my go-tos. If you don't have just a good general step count, if you're not hitting like between 8 and 10,000, your baseline aerobic health probably is not very good. Even if you're doing resistance training 4 or 5 times a week, probably still need to benefit from doing more steps. So increasing your step count is very low-hanging fruit, and it's a fantastic way to just increase your general aerobic health. Next, we can do sport-specific conditioning. So, again, having specific circuits that are dedicated to increasing your conditioning that are simultaneously enhancing your level of hypertrophy or doing things you need to do to actually enhance your capacity for your actual training that you're trying to do. Okay. Now, some practical considerations. First off, we have to look at your historical workload. So if you're like a 300-pound powerlifter who's never done anything before, and you decide to start, improving your conditioning because you really feel like it's time to do that, and you think your training is really going to benefit, starting to run 3 times a week is probably a really bad idea. You're a really big guy, and you're not used to running. It's going to be an incredible amount of load on your Achilles, knees, your hips, just everything. And you're not used to that type of eccentric loading, right? You're just not used to it. So the impact, everything is probably going to mess you up pretty bad. So we need to think about scaling the intervention to what it is that you're capable of doing, right? So starting off small and then progressing. If we go from 0 to 100, your risk of injury can go up. Again, your fatigue is going to go up dramatically, which very likely is going to hinder your performance in training. And your primary training is the thing you want to enhance. And so if this is something that's detracting from it, it means we're doing things wrong. So we want to make sure that we're taking a graded exposure approach. So we're easing into it. Just in the same way, if someone wants to squat 600, you don't just load 600 on the bar. You say, okay, well, what can they do right now? And then you probably scale it back to like, let's say 70% or 80% or something they can actually manage. And then over time, you kind of build up. So next, we look at the actual conditioning implement. Are they going to be rowing, running, walking? Is it sport-specific GPP or anything else? Like, how are we going to implement the actual conditioning protocol? Are they going to be using a ski erg? Are they going to be using an Airdyne bike or just one of those fixed bikes? So all of these things matter because even if you're doing, let's say the protocol is 10 minutes of zone 2 type conditioning, right? If you do that running versus rowing versus swimming, they're going to be very different in terms of the total amount of fatigue that's generated. Even though the relative intensity is the same, the fatigue generated, the energy cost are going to be different, or at least can be different. So understanding which conditioning implement you're going to use is important, which one feels the best for you. So again, having a really big guy doing lots of rowing, probably not the best thing because a lot of the times big guys, their back is just going to blow up. Their low back is just going to be so jacked up and pumped, probably not a very good idea. Whereas for them, maybe doing some walking, maybe doing the bike could be great. Maybe doing some, like sport-specific conditioning, pulling a sled, pushing a prowler would be a better idea for them because it's low impact and it's going to get their heart rate up, but then it's not going to be crushing their back or hurting their joints or anything like that. Next, we look at the fatigue considerations. So what's the frequency? What's the density? What are we doing from like a duration standpoint and all of these things. So understanding the fatigue costs of things is going to be really important. So always it's best to start off smaller or less than you think you need to and then scale up from there. It's going to be much harder if you push too hard and have to dial things back. You're going to waste maybe a week or two of, kind of semi-unproductive training. Whereas if you just take it easy, you can see how your body adapts and then slowly and gradually increase from there. Okay, so again, slow and progressive. Adopt a very graded approach. More is not better. Again, we want to make sure that we're not increasing the amount of fatigue that you experience. We're actually just enhancing your ability to recover and train effectively and maintain a high output. So we're going to go over a case study. This is one of my clients, and this is just kind of a general breakdown of what we did to enhance their actual strength performance. So when they came to me, they were very, very out of shape, essentially. So this particular individual was a powerlifter. They were 100 kilos. Well, they competed at 100 kilos, but they were about like 106 kilos, kind of walking around. It was a male, roughly 20%, 27% body fat, about 7 hours of sleep per night. They'd average about 2,600 steps a day, sometimes as high as 3,000, but usually it was somewhere within that range. They were sedentary in terms of their job. They had an office job. They worked from home, and so they didn't really get a whole lot of movement throughout the day. They had moderate stress levels, so nothing too crazy. Their nutrition was average. Their protein was good, but they didn't really do a whole lot in terms of food quality or nutrient timing. They didn't track their calories or anything like that. So they didn't really have anything dialed in, but there was quite a bit of room for improvement. They trained 4 times per week, and each training session was roughly 2 hours in duration. Okay, so this is just some general background of this particular individual. So, couple things that we can see right off the bat. Okay, this is essentially what the progression looked like for this particular individual. So month number 1, we worked up to about 6,000 daily steps. Okay, so the goal was by the end of the month to get to 6,000. They were not hitting 6,000 on week 1. Okay, and I want to be very clear about that. So I believe week 1 they ended up getting like pretty much the same as they normally do. I don't think they actually increased. I think they got like 3,000 on average, right? But then week 2 they got up to about 4,000. Week 3 they got up to about 4,700, and then week 4 by the end of it they were getting 6,000 a day, and then moving forward they were getting 6,000 consistently. Okay. But it took about a month to actually get up to that. And that's perfectly fine, right? Because again, like I said, we need to understand that this is a graded approach. And also, these don't exist in isolation. This individual is very busy with work. They have other competing priorities. So we need to make sure that we're scaling the intervention appropriately for what this individual can actually take on and sustain and manage and actually adhere to long term. That's the most important thing. The next thing we did was we actually reduced their rest periods on their accessory exercises. So this, to be clear, this was a new client that I took on. And so, because like I said, I pretty much do that with all of my clients, but this was a new client. They weren't really timing their rest periods and we're doing anything like that. So I reduced their rest periods on their accessory exercises. So they could still take really long rest periods in their main work. So I know that this particular individual is taking about 7 minutes to 10 minutes on their squats, on their bench, things like that. So I didn't necessarily want to push too much too soon. I just said, hey, for your accessories, this is what we're going to be doing for rest. Now, for this particular individual, I reduced their rest periods to about 60 seconds, okay? And if they were doing, I'll kind of get into it later, but if they were doing supersets, like they might be doing dips supersetted with like a Pendlay row, in that case, they'd only get 90 seconds, so it's still not very long rest. And they're just go, 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 right? And so that gets their heart rate up, it gets them sweating, and it really does a whole lot to improve their actual conditioning and fitness. And so then we increase the actual work density, like I said, using supersets. Okay. Now, month number 2, we ended up working to 8,000 daily steps on average. Now, this only took about the first 2 weeks. So after the first month of that kind of initial ramp up, it was very easy for them to just jump from 6 to 8,000. So again, if we look at this now, it took us about 6 weeks to get from about 2,600 to 8,000. Okay, so that's like tripling. That's a little over tripling their daily workload. Okay, so when you think about it from that perspective, it's not just 8,000 steps. We're tripling the total volume that they're doing. And that's really important to understand, is these things might look like they're not a lot, but they can absolutely make a big difference in terms of someone's ability to recover. Okay, now on lower body days, what we did was we'd actually do a warm-up. This was actually their warm-up. They would do 10 minutes of paced ski erg intervals, 20 seconds on, 20 seconds off, and they would do that 2 times a week. Now, the reason why we do ski erg stuff on their lower body work is because I wanted their lower body to still be fresh. I didn't want to be doing a bunch of conditioning that was going to fatigue them. And if they're doing their conditioning prior, it did a couple things. One, they got warm. They were sweating. They were feeling really good. This particular individual had a hard time warming up for their squats. It just took them a really long time. So I thought this would be a really great opportunity to actually help them increase their core temperature and kind of prep them a little bit. So the one thing that I will say is you won't see any of the actual prep work that we're doing. This is just their conditioning protocol. But then after this, they also were doing specific stuff to kind of warm up their hips and their knees and their ankles, like to prep them for the actual movements they were doing on that day. But this was to really increase their core temperature quickly. So this was not a balls to the wall, all out 20 seconds interval. This was a paced ski erg. So they were going at a good pace, but nothing that was too crazy. But by the end of the 10 minutes, they'd be pretty damn tired, right? Now you might think that, oh, you don't want to, build up a bunch of fatigue because then they're going to be super tired for their squat session. And in the first week, yes, they're a little bit fatigued. However, by week 2, they've adapted like that. Because again, you got to think, we're not doing total body conditioning. We're doing a ski erg. This is upper body focused. So we're not actually fatiguing a lot of the muscles that are going to be performing the work. And this certainly isn't fatiguing enough to be, peripherally fatiguing to your nervous system or anything like that. So again, there's guidelines, but once you kind of know the rules, you can learn to break the rules. So I probably wouldn't recommend this for people just starting out. However, for this particular individual, I did have a suspicion that this was probably going to be pretty effective for them. And for him, it actually really enhanced his training output because he was super warm. His squats felt really good. During his warm-ups, they felt really great. And so he wasn't taking so long to warm up. And so he wasn't as exhausted because he was doing less volume to actually warm up because he just felt better from the start. So his sessions actually improved because of this. But like I said, take that with a grain of salt. Then I switched all exercises to a timed rest. So, all of his accessories, all of his supplementary movement, and then all of his primary movement were actually timed. So for this particular individual, I actually reduced the rest periods down to 180 seconds. So that's 3 minutes. They'd be doing a heavy squat, 3 minutes rest, right back in. And again, one of the reasons why I didn't do this right up front, and it took about 2 months before we actually did that, was because I wanted him to build up enough of a capacity to the point where if we started switching everything at once, it wouldn't just destroy his training for like 3 to 4 weeks because he's just barely even keeping up, right? I wanted to make sure that we were able to ramp things up gradually so they'd be challenging. However, they wouldn't necessarily impede his actual performance and they would actually assist his performance, right? So like I said, the ski erg took about a week to adapt because it was fairly challenging. However, it didn't impair his performance in any way, shape, or form. And after that first week, he was actually getting better quality sleep because he was just a little bit more fatigued from the ski erg, and there was something about that that just helped his quality of sleep. He just felt better recovered, and so on and so forth. So hopefully that helps you guys understand a lot more about how conditioning can be incredibly important to incorporate into your training, whether you are focusing on hypertrophy or strength or really anything else. It's incredibly important to have a good baseline aerobic fitness level, not just for that, but also just for your general health. One thing to reiterate is there is a point of diminishing returns. So if you ramp up too quickly or if you just push too hard beyond a certain point, you're not going to get any additional benefits to your strength training, but you will actually start to see some degradation of your performance because you're actually allocating too much of your resources to your cardiovascular conditioning when that could be spent more intelligently on your hypertrophy or strength training. So if you have any questions, guys, leave them in the comments below. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you guys on the next one.